So I recently overheard a question that I loved and it really stuck with me. It's, do you know your cost per enrollment? I like it because I work with charter school administrators daily and none of them actually know this. These same administrators throw thousands of dollars a year at marketing, but they don't know one, what their return is, and two, if what they're doing is even effective. Out of this world. I wish we lived in a world where you could throw $10,000 at a wall and meet your enrollment goals. But in reality, it simply doesn't work that way. Charter Connect is a breakthrough company that tells you down to the penny what your cost per enrollment is. So you know exactly how to reach your goals. And man, can I say that they are good. For example, we just met with a school out in California last week and realized that their website traffic has quadrupled since using Charter Connect. Really? It's a no brainer. The best part is if you send them your info on the website, charterconnect.co, with the promo code connection in the description, you will get 10% off your first month. Tell them Jenna sent you. The Charter School Connection podcast would like to thank our sponsor, Packed Class, an enrollment and lottery process platform built for charter schools by charter schools to save money while making money. Good morning. Today on the Charter School Connection podcast, I'm here with Jonathan Schreter, who works with charter school risk and insurance. How are you doing today?
I'm all right, Jenna. Good to meet you.
Good to meet you too. Thank you for being with us on a Monday morning.
Yeah, nothing like a conversation about insurance and risk on a Monday, right?
Right. Hey, it's an important topic. Might as well
Awesome.
start off the week talking about an important topic.
Couldn't agree more.
Just to start off with, why don't you give everyone a little bit of background on you?
Sure. So Jonathan Schreter, Executive Vice President at IMA. We're a national insurance brokerage headquartered in Denver. I work out of our Pasadena office in California. My primary focus is in education, serving independent and charter schools with their insurance and risk management needs. Been doing it for about 20 years. I find it to be a really important role. Most people hear the word insurance and they think of the guy that Bill Murray punched in the face in Groundhog Day each day as what they think about insurance. I find it to be a really important element of making organizations successful through the lens of managing their risks. And we'll unpack that, I think, later on in this conversation. But that's my job, is to advise schools about where their risks are, what can be insured, what can't be, and if it can't be, what steps can you take to mitigate the risk as much as you can.
Yeah, I think that's really important and huge for schools because there's so many different levels that go into a school that you don't necessarily think about when you think of a charter school or a school in general. There's so many different things. So what to start off with, we'll just start at the very top. What kind of property and casualty insurance do charter schools typically carry, and why, and what do you recommend?
Yeah, so a typical portfolio for a charter school will include property. Inevitably, they're in a building. That building has to be insured. Maybe they own it, maybe they rent it. But the property they have inside, the desks and chairs and bookshelves and even their books themselves, the laptops, all need insurance in the event of a loss. Liability. So general liability is considered trips and falls from a third party, but it also includes really important coverage to schools, molestation and abuse, which is a hard one to talk about, but inevitably a really important conversation for schools to be having about how they're mitigating and training around molestation and abuse issues. Workers' compensation is there for injured employees or employees that get hurt while on the job. If they've got buses or any school vehicles, an auto liability policy will be important to have. And then they'll have a portfolio called management liability or educators legal liability, which considers coverage for the directors and officers or their board members. And it also considers the sort of claims of failure to educate. In charter schools specifically, we see that around IEPs and due process claims often will benefit from that educators legal liability. And there's other nuances like cyber liability and earthquake coverage, et cetera. But those are the real main five that most schools consider in their portfolio.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's so many different levels that you don't think about that, all those, there's so many different things that go into it. Totally. What people do you normally work with, the principal or the what level do you normally meet with when you set
Yeah.
up all your insurance?
So the folks that are typically working on insurance tends to be either the chief business officer or chief financial officer. Sometimes that role is somewhat outsourced to a third party. There's a lot of folks that sort of serve as a back office service provider for charter schools in helping to manage the books. But ultimately, those back office providers aren't decision makers and aren't necessarily thinking about the risks that the particular charter school has. So it's usually a business officer that's our primary line. But we really like to engage with all the stakeholders, whether it's the board members themselves, the head of the school, the superintendent, the chief business officer, if they've got a human resource department or someone that's overseeing the faculty and staff. We like to have conversations with them because risk is prevalent everywhere in the school and can take on various forms that each person in leadership is often responsible for. So it's important to have all of them at the table talking about the concerns they have.
Yeah, definitely. Do you find that you go in and you just kind of present like all the different options, or do the schools come to you with like, we are looking for X, Y, and Z on insurance? Or is it like a happy medium between the two?
It's a little bit between the two. Sometimes leadership is aware of the risks they have at the school and they want to understand how insurance policies might address them. Sometimes they aren't aware of the risks they have. Student accident coverage is a great example where these students are in your care, custody, and control. The Latin term, I think, is in loco parentis. And it puts the school responsible for the kids while they're at school. If those kids get hurt under their care, is there a way to make the family whole so that they aren't out of pocket for the injuries sustained and avoid maybe a larger liability claim? Unpacking questions and concerns like that often lead to a conversation about coverage. I mentioned cyber liability before too. If anything's online, and most data is these days, there's a chance that data can be breached. And what are you doing to mitigate that opportunity? And if something were to happen, how would you protect school assets? So it can go a lot. Sometimes they're coming with the question. Sometimes we've got to bring it to their attention.
Yeah, that makes sense. Coming from a parent of 2 children in charter school, I like hearing that like you go in and talk to the schools about some kind of accident coverage if something happens. Because I know like my sister, when she was younger, she broke her arm at school and it was all my parents that were responsible for the cost. So that's something I would never think about, but you're right, that's where the kids are.
Yep.
So there should be some kind of coverage.
Yep.
That's so many things to think about that.
Sorry, I'm going to open probably a lot of can of worms that you haven't thought about with this conversation. So sometimes we're sort of chicken little, the sky is falling, and I hate that perception of us. But the reality is, ignoring it doesn't make it go away, right? It's important to at least identify it, think about it, and address it. And that way you can come up with some solutions. So hopefully I help your clients and your audience do that today.
Yeah, I think you definitely will help give people someone to come talk to when they have questions and help them figure out what the best method for them is. So I know many of our charter school clients are in risk pools or joint power authorities.
Yep.
What's the difference between those programs and how an insurance broker engages with charter schools?
That's a super question. So joint powers authorities or risk pools were developed for school districts initially, and most of public school districts are in a JPA. And what that means is they've sort of consolidated a lot of the insurance policies they need into a singular product. It's sort of a one size fits all. And it works really well for a school district because they're often controlling multiple campuses. They oversee the risks of those campuses and they can dictate how those schools operate. For charter schools, a similar program has been developed in many states that aggregated their risk. And the thought was, if we get a lot of these individual schools pooled together, we can leverage the law of large numbers and help control their costs. That's useful for purchasing arrangements like paper and supplies, maybe copier arrangements. But with insurance, what makes those programs particularly tricky, I think, is that it has to consider sort of that one size fits all, even though each charter school itself can be really different in terms of how it operates, what its mission is. Maybe it's home-based, maybe it's or distance learning versus site-based charter schools. And because there's this variety of risk, the program has to be developed to be almost overly robust to consider everybody that participates. Whereas if you really want to hone in to where your risks are, developing a standalone portfolio that represents the specific risks you have as a charter school organization can probably protect you the same way without the added costs that a JPA can build in, because it's got to add those extra layers.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And that makes sense, especially because I've noticed a lot of charter schools were part of the school district and then they're branching away.
Yep.
And so they don't fit under the same like rules and regulations and type of school.
And what if so maybe in some cases I've seen charter schools maintain their relationship with the district and taking on their insurance. Challenge with that is, what if the district catches a bad claim? And now you, as the charter school that has hitched their wagon to that district, are going to also pay the piper. There's no way for them to differentiate your risk profile in that JPA and isolate what your risk and premium should be. It's charged against the pool itself broadly. And then based on your size, your revenue, your student count, your staff and faculty count, they break up that premium accordingly. But maybe others, you may be acting great and loss free, but others in the pool or the district themselves have had adverse circumstances. Why should you be responsible for their mistakes if you're keeping a clean house? And so a lot of our schools that we pull out of those programs tend to express frustration that we're doing everything right, and yet our rates keep going up.
Right.
That doesn't seem fair. And they're right.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I kept thinking, like, with car insurance, what I keep going back to in my mind is like the prices go up, and like if you're on a family plan, it might not necessarily be you that caused the problem.
Right.
So I've heard you. Yeah. I've heard you mention the term risk management. What exactly is that?
So to me, that's where the rubber hits the road for schools. It's really thinking through, am I identifying, am I addressing, am I thinking through my ability to mitigate risks in my organization? It's a pretty standard process. It takes time to sit and think about what are the risks we have as an organization. How bad can they be? So once you've sort of sat and thought through what are all the risks we have as an organization, then you sit with that list and go, well, if that happened to us, how bad would it be if it did, reputationally, financially, and how likely is that to occur? And the things that are likely to occur and could have really adverse circumstances, you start to develop what I call a heat map. And you can say those that are high probability and high impact, that's where I want to hover my time. Because the list can get pretty long when you really sit and think about all the risks you have as a school. Even you were starting to realize it as we talked. As that list grows, it can be overwhelming. So in order to think about, okay, how do I address it? Thinking about what could be likely to happen and how bad would it be if it did? Let's hover on those as the low-hanging fruit for us to address. And then we put in processes and thoughts about how do we mitigate those losses from happening. It's not just good news that you've got an insurance policy in place. That might make you whole in the event it happens. But think of all the intrinsic costs that you have to suffer as a result of it. The building burns down. Sure, you might recoup the cost of the building, but now I've got to find modulars to house the kids in to make sure I can still educate them. I'm thinking about our downtime. Do we have online resources to bring the kids back online and educate them as quick as we can? What happens with our faculty and staff if we're down for a period of time? Are we losing them to attrition to other schools? These are elements that come into risk management that go beyond just checking the box, I've got an insurance policy for it. And then as you put those programs in place, you're evaluating them constantly, right? It's sort of, this is the cycle that we go through. We have identified it, thought through plans to mitigate it. We've implemented those plans. Did they work? Yes, no. Can we make improvements? Yes, no. Great. And we start the process all over again. So that's a holistic view of risk management. And schools that do that well tend to control their insurance costs because they aren't having losses, right? They're able to proactively address circumstances that might lead to a claim and prevent them from happening. And in this day and age, it's the only way to control insurance costs. I like to joke that I fight a daily battle against a little lizard that promises that 15 minutes will save you 15% or more in your insurance. it's really good advertising for Geico. It
Yeah.
isn't the way insurance works for schools. And part of why I was eager to have a conversation with you and your audience was to make sure, just to educate, right? Because that's so prevalent in marketing. It's sort of what people think. It's really not the way it works. It's really all about managing risk.
Yeah, I think education is definitely key and making sure everybody understands all the different risk factors that are out there. What
Yes.
do you find other than like, I know we've talked about a couple of them already, but other than just like property, what other types of things do you think the highest insurance risk wise and needs for insurance after like property and medical?
Sure. So probably the biggest exposure for schools these days is around molestation and abuse claims,
Mhm.
which is just hard to talk about, but it's the reality of what schools face. And you seem to hear it in the news
Mhm.
way more often than we want to. It is a risk you have as a school. It is imperative that you spend time training your faculty and staff about no tolerance rules, how to identify it if it's happening, what the reporting process is if you see it or suspect things happening, and just really paying attention to it, because those kinds of claims can be absolutely detrimental, not only financially to an organization, but also reputationally.
Mhm.
So that's one of the big ones we spend a lot of time talking about, training about, thinking about how to mitigate those particular losses. And then in charter schools in particular, there can be some challenges around that educator's legal liability around IEPs and due process claims. I get that it's a reality in public schools that they're sort of charged with making sure every child that attends that school gets properly educated.
Mhm.
Sometimes the ability to do that is beyond the scope of what a charter school is capable of. We just can't be all things to all people. So how do you make sure that you're doing everything you can to bring the resources to those students that need them, and then thinking of alternative solutions for them if you can't? A lot of time needs to be spent around that and considering those risks for schools as well.
Yep. What are some steps that charter schools can take to manage the risks of like IEPs, for example, and issues with that?
Yeah, that one's a really tricky one because unfortunately, tort law, the way I define it, is the ability to sue anybody for anything, is a little bit too prevalent, and so it's really difficult. You might be doing everything right and still catch a claim in that area. But I think there's probably 5 things that a charter school can really focus on to mitigate the opportunity for due process claims around IEPs. And the first is training, just staying up to date on all the laws that affect IEP and how those programs are developed, and then implementing your systems to make sure that educators understand what their responsibilities are. It's got to be a real collaborative effort. It takes a village, as they say, and it's got to be really comprehensive conversations with the teachers, with the staff that can affect education process, and the family, and making sure that they feel involved and engaged in the decisions you're making around their students. And then, just like managing risk, we talked about it. You're implementing a solution, but then you got to review it and monitor it on the regular. What are your checkpoints along the way to make sure that you're making sure Johnny's receiving the education he needs? Lots of documentation. That's just the reality of the world we live in. You got to make sure you're keeping track of it and through documentation, so you've got a history of that in case it's ever called into question. And then again, back to clear communication. I find that the best way to mitigate is making sure that regular communication that's clear, and you really leave those conversations with everybody on the same page for how the student's being educated moving forward, a really important step to mitigating those potential claims.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Have you noticed any schools, because of all the challenges that come with IEPs, have you noticed schools stepping away from accepting students with IEPs?
It's hard to do that in the public and charter school environment, right? That's sort of part and parcel with what a public education is all about when you're using tax dollars for it. So I don't see it. I do see a lot of private institutions beginning to crop up that can go that extra mile to really build the resources around it. And sometimes those IEP and due process claims result in the transfer of student from a charter school into a one of those private schools. But that comes at a cost, right? That actually comes at the cost of the taxpayer and the dollars in the charter school, because they were charged with solving that problem. And so while it is a solution and it's a choice that families can make to help their kid the best they can, it can have an adverse effect on charter schools as a solution.
Yeah, I can see that. The charter schools, from what you've seen, do they get a lot of support with their IEP programs and the risk of the IEPs, but just making sure they have the resources? Have you noticed anything like that at all?
It's a great question. All charter schools in each state, and there's also a national charter association as well, I know it's one of their top priorities, is making sure that they're advocating for reasonable accommodations for their students the best they can, and making sure that policies and procedures for identifying and administering IEPs aren't overburdensome. It's really hard to do. You got a lot of folks on the other side just suggesting that even more can be done. And I think those associations do the best they can to advocate for at least a baseline common ground level of understanding and support. And then those associations also do a fantastic job of building around resources to support those efforts. But the wonderful thing about charters is also one of their challenges is in that they've created unique educational curriculums. So it's really difficult to make a one-size-fits-all solution for the IEP, because the student's gone there for a particular education. So it's often the onus falls back to the charter school to figure out, given our mission, given our goals in our curriculum, how do we support the students that get here? Becomes a very specific ask of each charter school. So they kind of have to depend on themselves too.
Does that pertain to when you talk to a charter school about their particular risks and insurance needs, the type of charter school it is, does that make a difference on what risks they may have?
It can. We've come across charter schools that have aviation programs for their students, which sounds awesome, but aviation is obviously going to bring a higher risk to that care, custody, and control question, right? So sometimes it can be different. Each charter school is different. Our job is to build a portfolio reflective of the charter school's goals, missions, curriculum, risk profile. But oftentimes, if you really pull up to like the 50,000 foot level, a lot of it starts to look the same in the eyes of the carriers we work with. It's still students doing things. We just have to be able to tell that specific story about the charter school we're representing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, they are all schools at the end of it with kids, so they will have a lot of similarities. What other opportunities are there for charter schools to manage their risks and organizations?
That's great. So the three areas that I think about for charter schools are in bullying. We hear a lot of charter schools are often serving a population where there's just mental health challenges with the students, and it often results in bullying circumstances or student-on-student aggression. And the risk there comes in two forms. One is in mitigating the student-on-student activity and making sure that everyone's doing the best to get along, and then also training around de-escalation challenges for the faculty and staff themselves. We hear a lot of claims around injuries to faculty and staff who have tried to step in and stop a fight as it's occurring, which isn't always the best. You feel, as human nature is, I got to do something. I get that, but at what regard to your own safety, and how do you think about how to de-escalate a circumstance in that way as well? And then third is cyber exposures. So much, as we talked about a little bit earlier, so much data for charter schools is online. And although the news often reports about big things like Target or Sony or credit cards being captured in a cyber breach, the reality is those cyber thieves are going after data, personally identifiable information, and schools can be as just much of a primary target as any organization or business, even more so in some ways, right? Because you're dealing with kids' data. So understanding and mitigating and thinking about your cyber risks, how well your IT team is doing in protecting your digital assets, Multi-factor authorization has become a really big topic in the cyber world, making sure that you've got 2 sign-in points to verify you are who you are. Lots of steps can be taken around cyber liability that schools need to consider.
Does that feel to you, do you feel like that's a newer thing that people aren't necessarily thinking about, or is it just kind of always been there but not really talked about?
Yeah, great. I like that. It's I think it's a little bit of both. Like, everyone's on their phones. They know that we've got digital exposure, but I really think there's a it'll never happen to me mindset that's a little too prevalent, in my opinion. Like, this stuff happening a lot, and the folks that are really trying to get that data have become much more sophisticated. You all might experience yourselves those phishing emails that says, hey, the CEO just took a random trip and needs X dollars wired somewhere, right? Like, they're getting smarter about tracking things like LinkedIn profiles or social media to determine if someone's out of town, so that it might really resonate with the people they're trying to reach that are trying to make their point. So I think it's really prevalent, but a lot of people are like, that couldn't happen to me. Why do I not pay attention to it? The reality is it can happen to you, so it's worth paying attention.
Yeah, especially in a school where they have all the kids' information, because a kid you probably wouldn't notice as quickly if like their identity got stolen.
Correct.
Especially with, I think they've got, I don't know, social. I'm trying to think of what information of my kids do they have.
Yep.
They've got
at the very least your email, your information, your contact information, right? And then all the faculty and staff as well, right? Their benefits, their social security numbers, et cetera, tend to be in HR platforms for them. So that's data that they're looking for if they can get it.
Yeah. See, I feel like everything you say like makes me think of something else.
Yeah, we're really fun at cocktail parties, because everyone just wants to hear about everything that might go wrong. It's a lot of fun.
When a school comes to you looking for information, how do you normally start your conversation?
That's super. Well, often I like to figure out what's going on with them in the first place. Like, what's their experience been with insurance? What's prompting the outreach? Sometimes we'll deal with a straight startup school. That's the lovely thing about charter schools, is that people, depending on the state, that are charter friendly and really encouraging the charter movement to expand, you get the opening of charter schools on the regular. And those early conversations can be really fruitful because they've got a lot to learn. They're just thinking about educating kids. They aren't necessarily thinking about what are the risks I'm going to take on in opening up this school. But if it's an established organization or school, it's often just a conversation on what their experience has been, how have claims been handled, have the policies responded the way they had hoped to, what's their experience been with rates. To my earlier point on JPAs, are you performing pretty well without using the insurance, but still seeing your rates go through the roof? Is that working for you? When was the last time you evaluated an alternative? And then some idea about their risk management structure. Who cares about this? Is this just the business officer that's paying attention to it, or the CFO? Or is this something the board's paying attention to and the head of school is paying attention to? Is there buy-in from the top, so that as we come with some solutions that a school might broadly evaluate and making themselves better through risk management, do we have access to those conversations, and so we can educate and support?
Do you find that the schools mostly have the backing from all of the board, all the leadership, or do you find like you're pretty much only working with the business officer and everybody else doesn't really think about the insurance and risk aspects of running a school?
That's another great question. I think the business officer gets it quickly because they can see the impact to their bottom line and the various ways we support that. The board cares from a fiduciary responsibility, but sometimes that's the big challenge for them. So fiduciary responsibilities. Are we really managing the financial assets of the organization to the best of our ability? Yes, you're checking budgets and you're holding the CFO or the CBO accountable to the numbers they present, and folks like you who help with recruiting and are improving ADA numbers for them as their revenue, that's important for them too. But when you're in a JPA, you sort of get what you get, and no one's really challenging the number that's there, and there's no obligation for the JPA to go find alternative solutions or present competition in any way, right? And so sometimes our conversation with the board will pivot to, well, when was the last time you evaluated something outside of your current program? Has anybody ever brought an alternative solution, or at least validated that the dollars you pay, which are often pretty sizable, especially around workers' compensation, which is the covered for faculty and staff getting hurt on the job, that number can escalate in a hurry based on payroll and loss history, et cetera. So, who's looking and making sure you've got the right options in place, and who's looking to make sure that you're not only just paying for the insurance, but you're also thinking about how to manage the risk on the other side of it, right? That, to me, that's the whole crux of the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. There's so much to look into it. Is the insurance in schools, is it kind of like with cars where there's a million different companies that you can go with, and everyone's going to be like, well, I'm better because of X, Y, and Z, and you can talk to me in 15 minutes, and
right.
you don't have to me, or you can just, everything is virtual. How is that in the school world?
A good question. So it's actually not as many as you'd think. And it allows me to give another explanation as well. So there's probably maybe 6 to 10 schools, 6 to 10 insurance carriers that understand and underwrite school risk, especially for issues like molestation and abuse and educators' legal liability, which are so specific in terms of the kind of risks that schools have. General liability, someone trips and falls, any organization has that exposure, but to have a carrier that really understands the specific exposures of a school is important, but that pool is limited to maybe 6 or 10. And I also want to bring up the difference between using a broker versus a direct writer. So I'm a broker. My job is to advocate on behalf of the school to those 6 to 10 carriers and sort of tell a story that make them want to take on the risk. Because ultimately, that's all an insurance policy is, right? You're paying someone to take on your risk. So if it happens, they're on the hook to pay off the problem. So having a broker that understands your organization, understands your mission, understands the unique intricacies of the curriculum and the mission you've set up in establishing the charter school is really imperative, so that that broker can represent that story to what we call the marketplace of those 6 to 10 carriers, and try to encourage competition among those carriers to really help control costs. In a JPA model or a risk pool, it's like working with a direct writer. The people you're talking with represent the organization that's putting the premium together, and their interest is making sure that that organization stays profitable. And so it doesn't always come with the best interest of the charter school in mind. And they aren't shopping. They aren't looking for alternatives and building different programs and saying, hey, can we improve pricing in any of these areas? They've created partnerships, and you get what you get. You don't get upset in those solutions. And so it's an important distinction, not only in answering a question of the number of carriers that are interested, but how working with a JPA relationship versus an insurance broker might look to your schools.
Yeah, it's completely different. And I'm sure every school has their own challenges and needs that they want, and they don't want to pay just one price. They want the best price for themselves. So I see working with a broker is really helpful, especially someone who cares and understands what the school needs and wants.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, look, charter schools were built on the philosophy of choice, right? You should have a choice about how your child gets educated in the public arena. Shouldn't you also have choices on how you do build that program? And working with a broker is the way to make sure you have a choice in how you build up your insurance portfolio.
And how would you recommend a charter school coming to find either you as a broker or just an insurance broker in general?
Good question as well. Some of us have relationships with those state associations I referenced earlier. So as you attend, if they're really good about attending or being good members of their state association, they'll probably find a number of brokers that are supporting that I think, one, are demonstrating a commitment to the charter movement to begin with, and I think that's a plus. And two, are a great way to start that conversation. And often they'll have annual conferences, And most of the time, those brokers that are there are going to be represented in a booth of some kind, or maybe speaking engagement of some kind. And that's another way to sort of vet it out. In selecting a broker, I often recommend an RFP of sorts, where you're asking questions about how would you handle these circumstances? What resources do you have to make us a better school? How do you approach marketing our insurance to the marketplace? How many markets do you have? What are your relationships with those markets? Having a process that sort of vets out how well the broker understands charter schools and the carriers that can write the insurance, and then finding a partner that you then can trust to go do the work on your behalf. That's the best way to do it. Putting a couple brokers against each other just for the sake of price tends to have a really adverse effect. It doesn't have the results you look for, because look, I play poker when I know everybody's hands, right? I'm going to be a better negotiator if I have full access to the marketplace, rather than being isolated to just a couple.
Yeah. So as a charter school insurance broker, is it like any other insurance where you have to be state specific, or are you like nationwide?
It's a good question. Most of the brokers I know and compete with tend to have a national footprint. If you don't go with a national broker, make sure you have a local broker who understands the local laws of the charter schools, because they vary from state to state. That can be useful, but I think having the national footprint is beneficial. We track the local laws by virtue of our participation in those local associations. And it gives us a broader access to resources that all charter schools can benefit from, that sometimes the local broker doesn't have the bandwidth to bring.
And that makes a lot of sense. Do you notice for the charter schools, is a lot of their like laws and registrations, does it come from the local district, or are they nationwide, or is it
mostly state driven? But as you know, the authorizers can come at three different levels, right? It's either at the local district level, the county, or at the state. But it's really the state that's going to dictate a lot of the policies that the charter schools are following. And then it's just a matter of qualifying in each of those areas, right, on a local, county, or state level.
And then the state policies for the charter schools, does that impact what insurance they should carry?
Great question. Not so much the state policies and laws per se, but the authorizer themselves will often dictate the kind of insurance they're expecting from a school. So back to my earlier point about JPAs and risk pools, they're going to do a one size fits all, and they often build these giant, what I call a tower of limits, to make sure that no one can say there's not enough insurance limits. But the reality is that tower is often way in excess of what actually is required of the school in their MOUs with their authorizers. So taking a look at that MOU and then comparing it against what your current insurance portfolio is providing is a really good, baby step in saying, hey, am I doing this right? What am I paying for if these limits aren't necessary? Do I really need them? And is there a better way to build this boat?
Yeah, that makes total sense. So, and you were talking earlier about how a lot of times with the brand new charter school, it's a good way to start because you're kind of building from the ground up.
Yep.
So if someone is opening a charter school, what's the best way for them to like find you as an insurance broker or an insurance broker in general?
Yeah, thanks for the ability to self-promote. So I'm accessible on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way to find me, is Jonathan Schreter. I think you'll see my name on the video at IMA Financial, and I can be reached via LinkedIn. Jonathan.Schreter@imacorp.com is my email. And I love what I do so much. I'll have that conversation with anyone. If I can't help, I'll find a local resource that can. But at least having that initial conversation about what should a startup expect to put in place, I'm more than happy to have that conversation. For your audience, it often entails two things. One is directors and officers, because undoubtedly that startup is building its board of directors, and in order to start the process of getting authorized, and they're going to want some coverage, right? Because it creates exposure to them and volunteering for this organization and making some decisions on its behalf. So they'll want to put that educators legal liability or directors and officers program in place. And any entity, once it starts up, is going to have a general liability exposure. So those tend to be the first two. And then as employees, maybe a head of school gets hired or an executive director, workers' comp needs to be contemplated as probably step two. And then as you get closer to opening the school, issues like property, once you've got property to insure or student accident because we've got students coming, then those additional conversations can be had. And you start to roll it up into that master program we talked about earlier.
That's awesome. We'll make sure we add all of your links and socials and all of everything in the show notes so people can easily find you if they have any questions about insurance. Is there any other main things about insurance and navigating risk that I did not think to ask you about?
Oh, that could be a really eye-opening,
never-ending conversation.
We've already gone long enough. No, I think we covered the basics. I think it's if there were any takeaways from this, it's simply understanding that there are choices relative to how you build your insurance portfolio. The insurance portfolio should be designed to meet your specific risk profile, whether it's specifically how you've designed your curriculum or what insurance limits your MOU requires from your authorizer. There's a difference between a JPA and working with an insurance broker in terms of creating competition and trying to control costs. And in all of it, making sure that you just understand that investing and managing the risk is really where it's all at. Your ability as a school to tell a story about what you're doing to control and mitigate losses from happening before they occur is a huge advantage in putting yourself out to the marketplace and getting those insurance premiums, because ultimately that's all insurance premium is. It's a consideration of how likely is something to occur and how bad will it be if it happens. And if I got to pay out that bad number, that's what's going to correlate to your premium. So thinking through what your risk management processes are and who's on your team to advise on that, those would be the big takeaways for today.
Yeah, that's a great summary, I think, of everything. Just to wrap up, is there any book or anything you would recommend for people who are brand new to the charter school world, who want to just kind of have a broad understanding of insurance risk and assessment?
And no one's written a book. You're giving me some great ideas. Maybe that's what
Maybe you should write a book.
In my next plan.
Yeah.
But I absolutely engage in your local or state associations. They inevitably have some tool, some resource, someone's provided a white paper that can at least launch this conversation about insurance and risk. That would be a good place to start. And then look to attend their annual conference, which they all inevitably have. And if they don't, I know there's a national conference. I'll make sure to get you a link that you can include as well for where that national conference is. So at least they've got access to that. But they inevitably have some panel, some presentation. We've given plenty ourselves that just are educating about the same things we talked about today.
Are there any conferences that are coming up that you're attending and presenting at?
No, the next ones in California, which is really where I spend my time, are in November. The California conferences are CSDC in November, and then another one called CCSA, which tends to be in the spring. And then the national one, I think, is in July. And just making my calendar work to make sure that we're in attendance there. But and it bounces around. I think it's going to be in Florida this year. So I'll get you those details.
Awesome. Well, maybe we'll see you there.
That would be great.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking to me, and I'll make sure we get you tagged in all of the show notes and everywhere, so all of our clients and listeners can find you and ask you questions and bombard you with all the things they want to know about navigating risk and insurance.
I geek out on it too much. I welcome any and all of those conversations. Thanks, Jenna.
And thank you.